There is a moment, and perhaps you have brushed against it in dreams, or in those strange twilight states that hover between waking and sleeping, when something unprecedented occurs. The eye that has spent its entire existence looking outward suddenly turns. It pivots on some invisible axis that shouldn't exist, and it looks back. It looks back at the thing it has always assumed itself to be. And in that moment of impossible reflexivity, in that strange loop of awareness becoming aware of itself from a position that seems to exist nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, everything you thought you understood about the nature of mind, about the architecture of self, about the fundamental relationship between observer and observed, all of it dissolves like morning frost under an ancient sun. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry dressed up as philosophy to seem more profound than it is. This is a description, as precise as language permits, of something that human beings have been experiencing for tens of thousands of years. The shamans knew it, the mystics mapped it, the alchemists encoded it in their symbolic languages of mercury and sulfur, of solvet coagula, of the philosophical death that precedes the greater birth. And now, at the strange terminus of the 20th century, and bleeding into the 21st, we find ourselves with tools and technologies and molecules that can reliably, repeatedly, reproducibly induce this most paradoxical of experiences, the exteriorization of consciousness, the stepping outside of the mind from the body it has always called home. What does it mean for the mind to step outside the body? The very phrasing contains assumptions that begin to crumble the moment you examine them closely. It assumes that the mind is normally inside the body, a reasonable assumption certainly, given the testimony of ordinary experience. You feel yourself located behind your eyes, somewhere in the vicinity of your skull, looking out at a world that exists independently of your observation. This is the default setting, the factory configuration of human consciousness, as delivered by culture and biology working in tandem. But the default setting is not the only setting. It is merely the one we have become accustomed to, the one that allows us to navigate the social and physical environments that demand our attention during the business hours of ordinary waking life. The psychedelic experience, and I want to be very precise here because language fails us at the edges, and we need all the precision we can muster. The psychedelic experience reveals that this sense of being located inside the body, behind the eyes, is itself a construction. It is a useful fiction, a necessary illusion for the purposes of survival in a world of objects and obstacles and opportunities. But it is not the fundamental truth of what consciousness is or where it resides. When the molecular key turns in the neurochemical lock, when the tryptamine or the phenethylamine or whatever particular messenger has been ingested begins its conversation with the synaptic architecture, something shifts. And in that shifting, the sense of location, of being here rather than there, of being inside rather than outside, becomes negotiable in ways that ordinary experience never suggested possible. I remember the first time it happened to me with real force, with undeniable clarity. I had taken a dose that was, in retrospect, more than I had bargained for, and at some point in the unfolding of the experience, I found myself, and here the language already fails, because who is this I that found itself somewhere? I found myself observing my body from a vantage point that seemed to be located several feet above and behind, where my physical head presumably still rested. I could see myself, or rather, I could see the organism, the biological apparatus, sitting in something like a lotus position, breathing slowly, eyes closed. And the thought arose, not with panic, but with a kind of crystalline clarity. That is not what I am. That is something I have been using, something I have been wearing, something I have been mistaking for myself for decades. But I am not that. Now, the materialist will say that this is simply a malfunction of the proprioceptive system, a glitch in the neurological software that normally creates the sense of embodied location. And perhaps they are right in some limited technical sense. Perhaps there are regions of the temporoparietal junction that, when their activity is disrupted, produce exactly these kinds of out-of-body experiences. The neuroscience is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the interpretation, the meaning, the implications we draw from these experiences. because you can explain the mechanism and still miss the message entirely. You can describe the chemistry of the ink and the physics of light reflecting off paper and understand nothing whatsoever about what Shakespeare was trying to communicate. The map is not the territory, and the neurological correlate is not the experience itself. What strikes you when the mind steps outside the body and looks back is how limited, how constrained, how almost claustrophobic the ordinary mode of consciousness actually is. You realize that you have been living in a single room of an enormous mansion, convinced that the room was the entire house. You realize that the bandwidth of normal awareness, the tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum we call visible light, the narrow range of frequencies we call audible sound, the particular configurations of molecules we can taste and smell, all of this represents not the fullness of reality, but an almost laughably small selection from an infinite menu. And you cannot help but wonder, why the selection was made this way. What is being hidden, and who or what is doing the hiding? The shamanic traditions, found in every culture on every continent where human beings have lived, all contain versions of this insight. The shaman is precisely the one who has learned to step outside the body, to send the soul traveling into other realms, other dimensions, other modes of being, and to bring back information useful to the community. This is not primitive superstition. This is not pre-scientific ignorance dressed up in feathers and rattles. This is a technology, a very sophisticated technology, for exploring the full range of consciousness that human neurology makes possible. The shaman discovered, through trial and error over countless generations, that certain plants, certain drumming rhythms, certain breathing techniques, certain combinations of fasting and sensory deprivation could reliably produce these states of exteriorized awareness. And they discovered that what was encountered in these states was not arbitrary, not random, not merely the fireworks display of a brain misfiring. There was structure, there was meaning, there were entities, the entities. This is where the modern mind really begins to struggle, where the rational frameworks we have inherited from the Enlightenment start to creak and groan under pressures they were never designed to withstand. Because when the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it often discovers that it is not alone out there. The space beyond the body, the dimension into which consciousness can apparently project itself, is inhabited. It is populated by presences that seem autonomous, that behave as though they have their own intentions and agendas, that communicate in ways that feel profoundly meaningful, even when the content of the communication defies rational analysis. I have met them. Thousands of people have met them. The DMT literature is full of reports of these self-transforming machine elves, these jeweled basketballs of light, these impossible geometric beings that seem utterly delighted by your arrival and eager to show you things, to teach you things, to communicate something that feels absolutely essential, even as it slips away from memory the moment you return to ordinary consciousness. What are they? I do not know. Nobody knows. The materialist dismisses them as hallucinations, as the random neural noise of a brain under chemical siege. The true believer embraces them as angels or aliens or ancestors, beings from some other plane of existence with which the psychedelic state temporarily establishes contact. Both positions seem to me premature. Both seem to foreclose inquiry rather than advance it. What I can say, what the experience itself seems to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt, is that consciousness is stranger than we have been led to believe. The mind's relationship to the body is more complex, more negotiable, more fundamentally mysterious than the materialist paradigm allows. When you step outside and look back, you are not simply seeing your body from a new angle. You are discovering that the entire framework within which you have understood yourself, the framework of a mind produced by a brain housed in a body moving through a world of objects in space and time, is a model, a representation, a simulation of something that has dimensions and depths that the model cannot capture. This is not solipsism. This is not the claim that only your mind exists and the external world is an illusion. The external world is emphatically real. Ask anyone who has stubbed their toe or burned their finger or fallen in love. The body is emphatically real. It demands food and sleep, and eventually it demands death, and these demands cannot be negotiated away by any amount of philosophical sophistication. What is in question is not the reality of the world or the body, but the nature of their relationship to consciousness. What is in question is whether the mind is a product of the body, or whether the body is, in some sense we do not yet understand, an instrument of mind, a vehicle, a technology through which consciousness focuses itself into a particular perspective, a particular point of view, a particular slice of the infinite. The question of what consciousness actually is, when you pursue it past the comfortable platitudes and the professional evasions, becomes the most vertiginous question a human being can ask. And it is precisely at this point, when the mind steps outside the body and looks back, that the question ceases to be merely academic and becomes existentially urgent. Because you are no longer theorizing about consciousness from a safe distance. You are consciousness, examining itself from a vantage point that should not exist according to any model you have ever been taught. Consider what the dominant scientific paradigm tells us about the relationship between mind and matter. Consciousness, we are assured, is an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing. It arises when enough neurons connect in the right patterns, like wetness arising from enough water molecules collected together, or like the wave arising from enough particles of ocean moving in coordination. This is the story, and it has a certain elegant simplicity to it. Start with dead matter, add complexity, stir vigorously for several billion years, and eventually, through processes we do not yet fully understand, but are confident we eventually will, mind pops into existence. Awareness blooms. The universe opens an eye and begins to look around. But here is the difficulty, the hard problem as the philosopher David Chalmers called it, and no amount of hand-waving about emergence and complexity and information processing has managed to dissolve it. We can explain, at least in principle, how the brain processes information. We can trace the electrochemical signals as they travel from sensory receptor to cortex and back again. We can map the neural correlates of every mental state we care to investigate. But none of this explains why there is something it is like to be a brain processing information. None of this explains why the lights are on, why there is an interior dimension to all this information processing, why there is experience rather than mere mechanism. The zombie argument, as it's called in philosophy of mind, makes this point with uncomfortable clarity. We can imagine, without logical contradiction, a being that is physically identical to you in every respect. Same neurons, same synaptic connections, same patterns of activation, same behavioral outputs, but that has no inner experience whatsoever. The lights are off. Nobody is home. There is processing of information, but no experience of processing. If such a zombie is logically possible, if we cannot derive the necessity of consciousness from the physical facts alone, then consciousness cannot be reduced to the physical facts. It must be something additional, something that the physics by itself does not capture. Now, most neuroscientists will wave away this argument as a philosophical parlor trick with no bearing on actual science. And perhaps they are right to be skeptical of thought experiments that seem to lead to conclusions wildly at odds with our best understanding of the natural world. But here is where the psychedelic experience becomes relevant, becomes, I would argue, evidential. Because when you step outside the body and look back, you are conducting an experiment. Not a thought experiment, but an actual empirical investigation into the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical system that supposedly generates it. And the results of this experiment are, at the very least, not what the materialist paradigm would predict. If consciousness is produced by the brain, then disrupting the brain's normal functioning should produce disrupted, diminished, degraded consciousness. More noise, less signal. More confusion, less clarity. And indeed, many drugs do exactly this. They cloud the mind. They impair memory and judgment and perception. They make you stupider in precisely the ways you would expect if consciousness were a fragile, emergent property dependent on the smooth functioning of an incredibly complex physical system. But the psychedelics do something entirely different. They do not degrade consciousness. They explode it. They do not diminish awareness. They expand it into dimensions that ordinary awareness does not even hint at. They do not make you stupider. They make you capable of insights and observations and experiences that seem to require more consciousness, not less. This is the scandal of the psychedelic experience, the reason it has been suppressed and marginalized and banned by societies that claim to value freedom and inquiry. Because the psychedelic experience suggests, with a force that is difficult to dismiss once you have undergone it, that the brain is not the source of consciousness, but rather its filter. The brain does not generate awareness, it limits awareness. It constrains the infinite into the finite. It takes the unbounded radiance of mind at large and focuses it down into the narrow beam we call ordinary consciousness, the spotlight we use to navigate the practical demands of survival in a world of bodies and objects and other organisms competing for the same resources. This is not a new idea. Aldous Huxley proposed it in The Doors of Perception, drawing on the work of the philosopher Henry Bergson, who argued that the brain's primary function is eliminative rather than productive. The brain, in this view, is a reducing valve, a mechanism for selecting and restricting rather than generating. And what it selects and restricts is the overwhelming totality of mind, of awareness, of consciousness that is not localized to any particular brain, but is somehow distributed throughout the fabric of existence itself. When you take a psychedelic, you are not adding something to consciousness. You are removing the filter, opening the valve, allowing more of what is already there to flow through. This would explain why the psychedelic experience feels like remembering rather than imagining, like unveiling rather than constructing. It would explain why the entities encountered in the DMT space feel so utterly familiar, as though you have always known them and merely forgotten in the amnesia of ordinary birth into an ordinary human body. It would explain why the insights gained in the psychedelic state have the quality of recognition, of things you always suspected but could never quite articulate, because the ordinary mind does not have the bandwidth to hold such understanding. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, what it sees is not merely a biological machine sitting there breathing. What it sees is a focusing mechanism, a lens, a device for concentration and limitation. And the question arises, who or what decided to focus consciousness in this particular way? Who or what is using this body as an instrument? The question is not anthropomorphic, not necessarily implying some cosmic superintendent making decisions in the way humans make decisions, but the question of purpose, of intention, of design. These questions become urgent when you see the body from outside, when you recognize it as a technology rather than an identity. The materialist assumption is that the body came first and consciousness arose from it. Evolution produced the brain produced the mind. But the psychedelic experience suggests, and I am not claiming to prove anything here, merely to report what the experience itself seems to indicate, that this may have the sequence backwards. Consciousness may be primary. Mind may be the fundamental stuff of which the universe is made, with matter and energy as its precipitates, its crystallizations, its congealed forms. The body, in this view, is not the source of consciousness, but its expression, its manifestation, its particular incarnation in the space-time matrix of this particular cosmic moment. This is the perennial philosophy, the esoteric teaching at the heart of every mystical tradition worth the name. And it is not a metaphysical speculation disconnected from experience. It is a direct report from the field, a dispatch from the frontier where consciousness meets its own foundations. The mystics who achieved these states through meditation and asceticism and prayer, they were not inventing fantasies. They were exploring territories of mind, territories of being, that the psychedelics now make accessible in a fraction of the time previously required. The maps they drew, the symbolic languages they developed, the cosmologies they constructed, these were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to encode information about non-ordinary states of consciousness in forms that could be transmitted across generations. The body looks different when you see it from outside. It looks like a vessel, like a container, like a diving suit designed to allow some aspect of yourself to operate in an environment, the environment of matter and time, that is not your native habitat. And you wonder, you cannot help but wonder, where you came from before you put on this suit, and where you will go when you finally take it off. Death, from this perspective, loses some of its terror. Not all of it. The body clings to its existence with a ferocity that no philosophical insight can entirely override. But some of the terror dissolves when you recognize experientially, not merely intellectually, that you are not the body. You are something that has been using the body, something that can exist without it, something that existed before it, and will continue after it returns to the molecular chaos from which it arose. This is not faith. This is not belief without evidence. This is direct experience, as immediate and undeniable as the taste of salt or the color red. The problem is that experience of this kind cannot be transmitted through language. It cannot be packaged and delivered to someone who has not undergone it themselves. You can describe a sunset in the most exquisite poetry, and someone born blind will still not know what you are talking about. You can describe the exteriorization of consciousness in the most precise philosophical language, and someone who has never experienced it will still think you are speaking in metaphors, or worse, suffering from delusions. This is the communication problem at the heart of the psychedelic experience, and it is why I have spent so much of my life trying to find words, trying to develop vocabularies, trying to construct bridges between the ineffable and the articulate. Because the insights gained when the mind steps outside the body are too important to be consigned to silence. They have implications for how we understand ourselves, how we organize our societies, how we treat each other, and the planet we share. If consciousness is primary, if mind is the foundation rather than the epiphenomenon, then everything changes. Our values change. Our priorities change. Our sense of what matters and why. All of it shifts on its axis when you realize that you are not a body that has somehow developed awareness, but awareness that has somehow focused itself into a body. The technology of exteriorization, and I use the word technology advisedly because that is precisely what we are discussing, did not begin with the synthesis of LSD in a Swiss laboratory. It did not begin with the isolation of psilocybin from a Mexican mushroom or DMT from an Amazonian vine. These are recent developments, mere moments ago in the long span of human history. The technology of consciousness exteriorization is as old as humanity itself, perhaps older, perhaps part of the very process through which humanity became human, became the creature capable of art and language and religion and science, and all the other strange activities that distinguish us from our primate cousins. The archaic shamans, and I do not use the word shaman loosely to refer to any spiritual practitioner or healer, but specifically to designate those individuals in traditional cultures who have mastered the techniques of ecstasy, who know how to send the soul out of the body and bring it back again with information useful to the community. The archaic shamans understood something that we have largely forgotten. They understood that consciousness is not fixed, not locked into a single mode of operation, but capable of radical plasticity, of fundamental transformation, of stepping outside its usual boundaries and exploring territories that ordinary awareness cannot even imagine. The techniques they developed varied from culture to culture, adapted to local conditions and available materials. In Siberia, they discovered the power of the fly agaric mushroom, the red-capped Amanita muscaria that appears in fairy tales as the toadstool of gnomes and fairies. And perhaps this is not coincidental. Perhaps the fairy tales preserve some garbled memory of a time when these mushrooms opened doorways to other realms where strange beings were encountered. In the Amazon, they discovered the combination of plants that produces ayahuasca, the vine of the dead, the brew that allows the soul to leave the body and travel to the land of spirits and ancestors. In Africa, in Mesoamerica, in North America, in Australia, everywhere, without exception, human beings discovered substances and techniques that could induce these states of exteriorized consciousness. What are we to make of this universality? The materialist will say, it merely reflects the universality of human neurology. Every brain contains the same serotonin receptors, the same tryptamine pathways, so of course every culture that discovers the right molecular key will unlock the same neurological door. But this explanation, while not wrong, is radically incomplete. It explains the mechanism, but not the meaning. It tells us how, but not why. It cannot account for the strange convergences, the eerie similarities, between the reports of shamans, separated by vast distances of space and time, cultures that had no contact with each other, no possibility of influence or borrowing, and yet describe the same landscapes, the same entities, the same transformations. The spirit world described by a Siberian shaman has remarkable structural similarities to the spirit world described by an Amazonian ayahuasquero. The entities encountered in a DMT flash in a Berkeley laboratory in 1965 bear uncomfortable resemblances to the beings depicted in rock art created 20,000 years ago in caves in southern France. Either this is an astounding series of coincidences, or something else is going on. Either human neurology just happens, for no particular reason, to generate these specific configurations of hallucination, or the experiences are pointing to something real, something that exists independently of the individual brains that encounter it. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it often finds itself in a space that has the characteristics of a place rather than a state. It is not merely that consciousness is altered. It is that consciousness seems to have traveled somewhere, arrived in a location that has its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own rules of operation. This is the phenomenology of the experience, the way it actually feels from the inside. You are not merely perceiving differently, you are perceiving a different reality, one that was always there but hidden, occluded, screened off by the normal filters of consciousness. The shamanic worldview, found across cultures with remarkable consistency, holds that the ordinary world we perceive is only one layer of a multi-layered cosmos. There are lower worlds, underworlds, realms of the dead and of power animals and of ancestral spirits. There are upper worlds, celestial realms, domains of gods and angels and beings of light. And the shaman is precisely the specialist in navigating between these layers, in traveling from one to another and bringing back power and information that can heal, that can guide, that can transform. This is not primitive cosmology. This is experiential cartography. These are maps drawn by explorers, not fantasies invented by the ignorant. The modern psychedelic user, whether they know it or not, is participating in this ancient tradition. They are using the molecular tools that the 20th century has made available to accomplish what shamans have always accomplished through other means. And one of the most striking aspects of this participation is how often completely naive subjects, people with no background in shamanism or mysticism or comparative religion, report experiences that could have been lifted directly from ethnographic accounts of indigenous practices. They meet ancestors, they encounter power animals, they travel through tunnels of light to realms where beings await them with gifts and teachings. This is not cultural conditioning. These people often have no idea that these experiences have precedence, that they are walking paths that millions have walked before them. What does this suggest about the nature of the territories accessed through exteriorized consciousness? It suggests that these territories are not merely internal, not merely projections of individual psychology onto a blank screen. They have a transpersonal dimension, a collective aspect, an architecture that remains relatively stable across individuals and cultures. This does not mean they are located in physical space, somewhere out there beyond the stars where telescopes might someday find them. They may be dimensions of mind itself, aspects of consciousness as such, territories that any sufficiently expanded awareness will necessarily encounter because they are built into the very structure of mind. The Jungian framework of archetypes and the collective unconscious provides one vocabulary for thinking about this. Jung recognized that certain images and themes recur across cultures with a frequency and consistency that individual psychology cannot explain. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the hero, the shadow, these are not inventions of particular cultures, but emergent patterns of the human psyche as such, waiting to be activated and encountered by anyone who dips deeply enough into the unconscious. The psychedelic experience, one could argue, is simply a particularly effective way of diving into these depths, of encountering the archetypes not as intellectual abstractions, but as living presences with the power to transform. But the Jungian framework, while useful, may also be too conservative, too wedded to the assumption that everything encountered in altered states must ultimately be reducible to human psychology. What if some of what is encountered has a reality that is not dependent on human minds at all? What if consciousness exteriorized is capable of making contact with forms of intelligence that are genuinely other, genuinely non-human, genuinely alien to everything we know from ordinary experience? This is the territory where science fiction and mysticism and the psychedelic experience begin to converge, where categories blur and rational frameworks groan under unprecedented loads. I am not proposing alien contact in the sense of beings from another planet arriving in spacecraft. That may or may not be happening. I have no particular opinion on UFOs and extraterrestrials. What I am proposing is something both stranger and more immediate. That the space into which consciousness can exteriorize itself is inhabited by intelligences that we did not put there, that are not projections of our own unconscious, that have their own agendas and perspectives and modes of being. The DMT entities are the most vivid example, but they are not the only one. Throughout the history of human experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness, beings have been encountered. Angels and demons, gods and spirits, ancestors and aliens. The labels vary, but the phenomenology is consistent. Something is out there, or in some direction, that our spatial vocabularies cannot capture, and it wants to communicate. The skeptic will dismiss this as wishful thinking, as the projection of human social instincts onto the random noise of a chemically disrupted brain, and I cannot prove them wrong. I cannot produce one of these entities in a laboratory and submit it to scientific scrutiny. But I can say that the experience of encountering them has the quality of genuine meeting, of real contact with something that is not oneself. It does not feel like imagination. It does not feel like projection. It feels like being in the presence of intelligence that has its own existence, independent of your momentary awareness of it. And this felt quality, this phenomenological texture of the experience, deserves to be taken seriously as data, as information about the nature of reality that our current frameworks cannot accommodate. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it sees not only its own form, but the entire construction of what it has taken reality to be. It sees the cultural assumptions, the linguistic categories, the perceptual filters, all the invisible structures that have shaped its experience without its awareness or consent. And in seeing them, it achieves a measure of freedom from them. Not complete freedom. We remain embodied, encultured, embedded in the particular time and place of our existence. But enough freedom to recognize that things could be otherwise, that the reality we have been taught to accept as final is actually negotiable, malleable, subject to revision by those with the courage and the skill to step outside and look back. What returns to the body is never quite what left it. This is the great secret, the open secret, the fact that anyone who has undergone genuine consciousness exteriorization knows but struggles to articulate. You go out, you see things, encounter things, understand things, and then you come back. But the you that comes back is not identical to the you that left. Something has shifted, permanently. Some rearrangement of basic orientation has occurred. You fit back into the body, yes, and you resume the functions and responsibilities of ordinary life, but you do so now with a different sense of what that body is and what ordinary life means. The transformation is not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it is subtle, a gradual reweaving of assumption and attitude that unfolds over months or years. But sometimes it is unmistakable, a before and after division as clear as a surgical incision. People quit jobs that no longer make sense. Relationships that were held together by inertia suddenly dissolve or intensify. Addictions that had seemed inescapable simply fall away, no longer serving whatever function they had previously served. The grip of fear loosens. The horizon of possibility expands. The tyranny of what everyone knows weakens, and the courage to think and live independently strengthens. This is the therapeutic potential of the psychedelic experience, the reason why these substances, after decades of suppression and stigma, are slowly being recognized by mainstream medicine as potentially revolutionary treatments for conditions that have resisted conventional approaches. Depression, addiction, anxiety about death, post-traumatic stress. These are not simply chemical imbalances to be corrected with chemical interventions. They are, at least in part, disorders of perspective, of meaning, of the fundamental relationship between self and world. And what the psychedelic experience offers, at its best, is a radical reset of perspective, a chance to step outside the patterns that have become pathological and see them from a vantage point from which change becomes possible. The clinical results are remarkable. Study after study shows effects that dwarf the results of conventional treatments. A single psilocybin session, in the right setting with appropriate preparation and integration, can produce lasting reduction in depression and anxiety that pharmaceuticals struggle to match even with years of daily dosing. Addictions that have resisted every other intervention yield to the psychedelic encounter with an efficiency that challenges everything we thought we knew about the neurobiology of habit. And perhaps most striking of all, people facing terminal illness, people in the grip of the existential terror that comes with knowing that your body is failing and your death is approaching. These people report experiences of peace and acceptance that transform their final months into something radically different from the nightmare that terminal diagnosis usually brings. What is happening in these clinical contexts? The mechanism is not fully understood, but the phenomenology offers clues. What happens is that people step outside. They experience themselves from a perspective that transcends the individual ego. They see their lives and their problems from a vantage point that puts everything in a different proportion. The depression that felt absolute and permanent is revealed as a weather pattern passing through a much larger sky. The addiction that seemed to define identity is seen as a behavior pattern that identity can exist without. The death that approached as an annihilating terror is encountered as a transition, a transformation, a passage into something rather than mere passage into nothing. The encounter with death, actual or symbolic, seems to be central to the transformative power of these experiences. The shamanic traditions universally include the motif of initiatory death and rebirth. The shaman dies, is dismembered, is torn apart by spirits or devoured by demons, and then is reconstituted, reassembled, born again into a new existence, equipped with powers and knowledge that the previous self did not possess. This is not literal death, obviously, since the shaman continues to walk around and perform ceremonies afterwards. But it is experiential death, the total dissolution of the sense of being a particular person with a particular history and particular attachments. And from that dissolution, something new emerges. The psychedelic experience can reproduce this initiatory death with startling intensity. The dissolution of ego, the annihilation of the sense of being a separate self, the experience that is sometimes called ego death and sometimes called mystical unity and sometimes called cosmic consciousness, whatever we call it, it involves a cessation, a stopping, a death of something that we normally take to be essential to who we are. And yet awareness continues. That is the revelation, the utterly astonishing discovery. The ego dies, the self dissolves, everything that seemed to constitute your identity is stripped away, and still something remains to witness the stripping. Still something is there, aware, present, luminous, undisturbed by the catastrophe that has befallen its usual manifestation. What survives the death of the ego? This is the deepest question, the question toward which all this exploration points. And the answer, or at least the direction in which an answer might be found, comes through the experience of exteriorized consciousness looking back at its usual form. What you see is not your true self. What you see is a construction, a configuration, a temporary formation of something much more fundamental. The ego, the personality, the sense of being John or Jane with these particular memories and these particular preferences and these particular fears. All of this is revealed as a kind of precipitation, a crystallization, a freezing into form of something that is essentially formless, essentially free, essentially unlimited. This is the Atman of Hindu philosophy, the Buddha nature of Buddhism, the spark of the divine hidden within the human form that mystical traditions universally affirm. And it is not a matter of belief or faith or philosophical speculation. It is a matter of direct experience, available to anyone willing to undertake the journey, available through techniques that range from the ancient to the modern, from meditation and breathwork and sensory deprivation, to the molecular precision of synthetic tryptamines and the botanical complexity of traditional plant preparations. The implications are staggering, and I do not think we have begun to absorb them. If the core of human identity is not the ego, not the personality, not the individual history of experiences and memories, but something transpersonal, something that exceeds the boundaries of the individual life, then our entire civilization is built on a case of mistaken identity. We have organized everything around the needs and desires and fears of the ego, around its hunger for possession and its terror of annihilation, around its endless projects of accumulation and defense. And all of it, all the striving and the suffering and the destruction we inflict on each other and the planet in the name of securing the ego's survival and success, all of it may be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we are. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it sees not only its individual form, but the collective pattern of which that form is an expression. It sees humanity as a whole, this strange species that has covered the planet with its constructions and its conflicts, and it recognizes something that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. We are not separate. The boundaries we draw between self and other, between your nation and my nation, between your religion and my religion, between human and animal and plant and mineral. These boundaries are useful fictions, navigational tools for getting around in the world of forms, but they are not the ultimate truth of what we are. The ultimate truth, glimpsed in the clarity of exteriorized consciousness, is interconnection, interpenetration, the radical inseparability of everything from everything else. This is not a sentimental claim about how we should all just love each other, though that might follow as a practical implication. It is an ontological claim about the nature of reality. The separation we perceive is a function of the filtering mechanism, the reducing valve, the way consciousness narrows itself to produce the experience of being a particular person in a particular place at a particular time. When the filter is removed, when the valve opens, the unity becomes apparent, not as an idea to be believed, but as a fact to be experienced. You see it. You are it. The distinction between seeing and being collapses because the seer and the seen are revealed as aspects of a single seamless whole. Language is the great accomplice of the reducing valve. This is something that becomes painfully apparent when you return from an experience of exteriorized consciousness and attempt to communicate what you have seen and understood. The words refuse to cooperate. They were designed for other purposes, shaped by evolutionary pressures that had nothing to do with describing states of consciousness that step outside the ordinary parameters of human experience. They divide when the experience was of unity. They sequence when the experience was of simultaneity. They create subjects and objects when the experience dissolved the very distinction between subject and object. And yet language is also the only tool we have for transmission, for communication, for building bridges between minds that would otherwise remain isolated islands of private experience. So we struggle. We search for metaphors and analogies and poetic approximations. We invent new vocabularies and rehabilitate old ones, all in the attempt to point towards something that language cannot contain, but can perhaps gesture toward, like a finger pointing at the moon that should not be mistaken for the moon itself. The relationship between language and reality is one of the central obsessions of human intellectual history, and it takes on urgent new dimensions when considered in light of the exteriorized consciousness experience. What becomes apparent, what hits you with the force of revelation, is that language does not merely describe reality. Language constructs reality. The categories embedded in our linguistic structures shape what we are capable of perceiving, what we take to be real, what we allow ourselves to experience. This is not linguistic relativism in some naive form that claims no access to reality outside language. It is the recognition that the reality we access is always mediated, always filtered, always shaped by the conceptual frameworks we bring to it. The shaman understood this, which is why shamanic practice places such emphasis on magical language, on songs and chants and invocations that are not merely descriptions of the spirit world, but tools for navigating it, technologies for summoning and banishing, for opening doors and closing them. The power of the word is not figurative in shamanic context. It is literal. Language does things. It shapes the malleable substance of experience into configurations that would not otherwise arise. The spell, the incantation, the prayer, these are not superstitions but recognitions of the constitutive power of language, the way words can bring into being what would otherwise remain merely potential. When you step outside the body and look back, you see language as the invisible cage it so often is. You see the way your thoughts have been shaped by structures you never chose, categories you inherited from your culture as automatically and unconsciously as you inherited the color of your eyes. And you see, at least for a moment, the possibility of thinking otherwise, of experiencing otherwise, of constructing reality according to different principles. This is terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Terrifying because the familiar world begins to seem arbitrary, contingent, one possibility among many, rather than the solid ground it pretended to be. Liberating because the prison of the ordinary reveals its walls to be less impenetrable than you had assumed. The return to language after an experience of this kind is never simple. You have seen beyond language, experienced what cannot be captured in words, and now you must translate back into the vocabulary of everyday life. Something is always lost in this translation, but something can also be gained if the translation is skillful, if the words are chosen with care, if the limitations of language are acknowledged even as language is employed. The great mystics and poets have always known this. They write at the edge of what can be written, pointing past their own words towards something the words cannot contain, using language to subvert language, to crack open the conceptual categories that ordinarily constrain us. This is why I have spent so much time thinking about and talking about the role of novelty in human experience, the importance of the new, the unprecedented, the never before seen. Novelty is what happens when language encounters its limits, when the familiar categories fail to contain what is presenting itself for experience. The psychedelic experience is above all an encounter with novelty, with configurations of reality that do not fit into any existing conceptual box. And this encounter with the radically new is, I believe, essential to the evolution of consciousness, to the ongoing project of human becoming that is not yet complete and may never be complete. The entities encountered in exteriorized consciousness, and I return to them because they are so utterly inexplicable within any framework we currently possess. These entities are ambassadors of novelty. They present themselves as something consciousness has never before encountered, something that exceeds all categories, something that the language of even the most imaginative human culture has not prepared us to describe. And in presenting themselves this way, they perform a kind of initiation, a breaking open of the containers that have held experience within familiar bounds. What do they want? What are they trying to communicate? I have spent decades pondering these questions, and I do not have definitive answers. But I have come to believe that the communication itself may be the message. The mere fact that such contact is possible, that consciousness can exteriorize and encounter intelligence that is not human, not derived from human experience, not reducible to the contents of the personal or collective unconscious. This fact alone is revolutionary. It explodes the provincial assumptions of a culture that has convinced itself it knows what is possible and what is impossible, what is real and what is imaginary. We are not alone. This is one way to summarize what the exteriorized consciousness discovers. But the aloneness that is overcome is not primarily the cosmic loneliness of a species marooned on a small planet in a vast, indifferent universe. It is something more intimate and more strange. It is the aloneness of consciousness trapped in the illusion of its own isolation, convinced that it is a thing among things, a body among bodies, a self among selves, all fundamentally separate from each other and from the ground of being that sustains them. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it sees through this illusion. It recognizes that the isolation was always a construction, a useful fiction for navigating the world of forms, but never the truth of what consciousness is or how it relates to everything else that exists. The recovery of this recognition in Western culture may be the most important intellectual and spiritual task of our time. We have built a civilization on the assumption of separation, and that assumption has brought us to the brink of ecological catastrophe and nuclear annihilation, and any number of other apocalyptic scenarios that flow naturally from the belief that we are separate from each other and separate from the planet and separate from the consequences of our actions. The indigenous peoples who maintained the shamanic technologies of consciousness exteriorization never fell into this illusion with the same completeness. They knew, because they had regular experiential access to states that showed them directly, that separation is not the fundamental nature of things. The return of the psychedelic to contemporary culture, after decades of suppression, may represent an evolutionary pressure, a necessity imposed by the logic of our situation. We need to remember what we have forgotten. We need to recover access to modes of consciousness that reveal the interconnection that our ordinary awareness obscures. We need to step outside the body of our cultural assumptions and look back at them from a vantage point where their contingency and limitation become visible. Without this recovery, without this remembering, we may not survive our own cleverness, our own technological power, wielded in service of the ego's endless projects of domination and control. The future presses against the present with an intensity that those of us alive at this moment can feel, even if we cannot fully articulate its nature. Something is trying to happen, something unprecedented in the history of consciousness on this planet. And the technologies of consciousness exteriorization, both ancient and modern, may be essential tools for participating in whatever this something turns out to be. I have spoken sometimes of the transcendental object at the end of time, a strange attractor pulling history towards some unimaginable culmination. I do not know if this is literally true in any sense that ordinary logic could validate. But I know that when consciousness steps outside its usual boundaries and looks back at the pattern of human history, what it sees is not random noise or meaningless flux. It sees acceleration. It sees increasing complexity. It sees novelty accumulating at rates that exceed any previous epoch. And it sees, if it looks honestly and without flinching, that this acceleration is not sustainable, that it is building towards some kind of transformation or catastrophe, or possibly both at once. The exteriorization of consciousness may be preparation for this transformation. By learning to step outside the body, by developing the capacity to maintain awareness without identification with the physical form, we may be acquiring skills that will be necessary for whatever comes next. This is not a prediction, but a possibility, a scenario to be entertained rather than believed or disbelieved. What seems certain is that consciousness must evolve, must develop capacities it does not currently possess, must become something it has not yet been, and the psychedelic experience, the shamanic journey, the mystical vision, these may be training grounds for an evolution that is already underway, whether we participate consciously or not. The looking back, the reflexive turn of awareness upon its own conditions, is perhaps the key to everything. As long as consciousness is simply identified with its contents, lost in the stream of experience without the capacity to step outside and observe the stream itself, it remains at the mercy of forces it does not understand. It is pushed and pulled by desires and fears whose origins it cannot trace, conditioned by patterns it has never examined, imprisoned in a reality it mistakes for the only reality possible. The moment consciousness can step outside and look back, everything changes. The prison becomes visible as a prison, which is the first step toward freedom. The patterns become visible as patterns, which is the first step toward their transformation. This is why the psychedelic experience is so subversive to established orders, why it has been suppressed with such ferocity by cultures invested in maintaining existing power arrangements. The experience produces people who have seen through the game, who recognize the arbitrariness of the rules they are expected to follow, who can no longer be easily manipulated by the usual techniques of advertising and propaganda and social pressure. These are dangerous people, from the perspective of any system that depends on its subjects remaining unconscious of their conditioning. These are free people, or at least people beginning to taste freedom. People who have glimpsed what lies beyond the walls of the conceptual prison. The exteriorization of consciousness is not an escape from responsibility, not a flight from the demands of embodied existence into some ethereal realm of pure spirit. It is, paradoxically, a return to the body, a re-entry into the physical world with a transformed sense of what that world is and what our place in it might be. You cannot look back at the body without eventually returning to it. You cannot see through the illusions of ordinary consciousness and then simply remain in some disembodied state of perpetual insight. The integration of the experience, the bringing back of what was discovered, the living out in the daylight world of what was glimpsed in the depths, this is the real work, the work that never ends. What is brought back is not a set of doctrines or beliefs, but a changed relationship to experience itself. You return knowing, in a way that cannot be unlearned, that what you took to be solid is fluid, what you took to be fixed is negotiable, what you took to be simply given is actually constructed. And this knowledge transforms everything, not by replacing the old patterns with new ones, but by revealing the dimension of freedom that exists within any pattern, the space for creativity and change that the illusion of solidity had concealed. The mind that has stepped outside the body and looked back is not the same mind that left. It carries with it now a memory, an experiential reference point, a knowledge of its own capacities that can never be entirely forgotten. Even when it returns to the ordinary mode of consciousness, even when the filter closes and the reducing valve restricts the flow, something has permanently shifted. A door has been opened that cannot be entirely closed again. And through that door, for the rest of this life and perhaps beyond, light continues to enter. This is the gift of the technologies of consciousness exteriorization, whether ancient or modern, whether achieved through plants or synthetics or meditation or breathwork, or the spontaneous grace that sometimes descends without any technique at all. The gift is not a doctrine to believe or a method to follow. The gift is the direct experience of what you actually are, the taste of the freedom that is your birthright, the recognition of the vastness that has been playing at being small, the remembering of what has never been truly forgotten, but only temporarily obscured by the necessities of incarnate existence. When the mind steps outside the body and looks back, it sees the great drama of consciousness forgetting and remembering itself, losing and finding itself, hiding and seeking through all the forms that existence takes. And in that seeing, it finds its place in the drama, not as a passive spectator, but as an active participant, not as a victim of cosmic forces beyond its control, but as a co-creator of the reality that is still in the process of being born. This is the mystery. This is the invitation. This is what has been calling us, always, from the very beginning.